What's up, you guys? Welcome back. If you're like me, when you first started flying, one of the first tricks you tried to learn was just a simple dive gap. And the core fundamentals of a simple dive gap are not that complicated to understand, right? You have a spot, you point the drone down, and you try to fly through that spot. That's pretty much it. But as you probably realize as you try taller and taller dive gaps, is that the drone doesn't really want to stay in that vertical position, right? It wants to drift. So why is that? Well, in today's video, I'm going to explain why that is specifically, and then I'm going to show you a trick to try and combat that and make your dive gaps a little bit easier. Now, quick word on gear. It doesn't really matter what size of quad you're flying. I just got my standard 5-inch here. This is the one I made. And another thing to note is the propeller that you're using. So in the past, people would typically use somewhere between usually a 4-inch and a 5-inch pitch propeller. Now, since then, it's kind of drifted downwards a little bit. I know 3.7-inch was popular for a while. Now it's even lower than that. I am personally rocking, I think they're 2.75-inch. The point is the industry has kind of shifted towards lower pitch propellers, but that actually is a good thing in this case. The name of the game here is precision. It's not about raw power, it's about precision. And the finer the propeller pitch, the more precision you have. And we're up. So, first of all, let's just look for a basic dive gap. Middle of the trees will suffice for this. Right, nice and wide open. Nothing too crazy. Plenty of space to mess up. Let's try that again. Let's watch our momentum this time. So I went ahead and took screenshots of the starting position and the end position of the drone. Now this first one here is zoomed in 4x, and I want you to take note of where the drone is pointing. You notice I pointed it straight down. I did not touch the sticks till the very end when I pulled out of the dive. Note that the drone is behind this little wood platform that I'm standing by. It is behind it. Okay, and now comparing that to the end of the flight just before I pulled out of the dive, note the position of that same platform. This is also zoomed in 4x. Note that I am significantly further ahead than I was at the start of the dive. Probably about half the table's length. Now that's very important. So throughout that entire dive of probably about 100 feet, I probably drifted somewhere along the lines of 3 to 4 feet. And that might not sound like a lot, but over such a long distance when you're trying to keep a really tight dive through a very small space, that can really add up and screw up your entire dive. Now let's keep watching. Now you may not notice it in these larger dive gaps, but your momentum is actually carrying you forward in the direction of the thrust, ever so slightly. Let's try this gap here and just see if we can notice it. See how I'm kind of drifting? I kind of drifted towards that tree there at the end. That's because the drone likes to drift in the direction of thrust. So in the direction the propellers are thrusting in. So what can we do to remedy that? Well, the thing I like to do is actually to roll into the dive. So I'll try it here. So I'm rolling. And instead of just one simple roll, the trick I like to do is actually to keep rolling the direction that you entered in. So let's try that on maybe a little bit tighter of a gap so we can see it. There, that was perfect. So that gap was so small that I couldn't even really see the ground. And if I were to just leave the quad pointed in the direction it was pointed, it definitely would have thrown me into the trees. So what I like to do is just to, when I enter the dive, I like to just keep rolling, keep on the roll stick. Like that. That was perfect. And by staying on the roll stick, it allows me to go more straight down, in the straight down direction. Otherwise, I end up drifting. We don't want that. Now, when you're doing these dive gaps, especially if they're really tall, you're obviously going to crash. And if they're tall, you're just going to crash harder. So I always recommend to do this on a soft surface. Here I got wood chips, pine needles, that kind of thing. It's a nice, soft landing area. But I did get it a few times, and I think I showed you guys the general process of what I do. But let's talk about it on the ground here quickly, just as like a debrief to make sure you guys understand what exactly I'm talking about. So here's my quad. I'm trying to go in a dive gap right here. So if I'm entering the gap, I'm just rolling and I'm going straight down, right? But now you got to look at what is the direction of my thrust when I'm going straight down? It's that way, right? So even at 0 throttle, there is still a small amount of thrust in this direction. And remember how I was talking about lower pitch propellers? Well, this is where that really comes in. With a higher pitch propeller, that thrust at 0 throttle, at 0% throttle, your stick's all the way down, that thrust with higher pitch propellers is going to be higher than it will be with the lower pitch propeller. So what does that mean for a dive gap? Well, when you're in a dive gap, when you're pointed straight down, if you have more thrust, that means you will drift more. So if I'm using a 4.5-inch pitch propeller, I'll drift more this way than I will if I'm using a 2.5-inch propeller, right? It's pretty simple physics. So that's why in this case, having a less powerful propeller actually helps you out. In fact, I haven't really been to this location since I started flying lower pitch, and I was pretty amazed at how little lateral thrust it actually has. But the concept still applies, especially for tall dive gaps such as this. And let's talk about the trick that we use to combat this phenomenon. So when I entered, instead of just pointing straight down like this and having all of my thrust point this way, I tried to do a spiral, right? So I was kind of spiraling down instead of just staying stationary. And what that did is it distributed that thrust force around an axis, right? I wasn't just going straight down, I was spinning, so all of that thrust kind of cancels itself out as you're going down. And what that means is you keep the same, lateral position all the way down that gap. Now, obviously, if your dive gap is just a piece of rebar or like monkey bars on a playground, this isn't really as applicable. When it really starts applying is when you have really, really tall gaps. So anything like this where I got these trees, it really comes in handy. Also, if you're like me and you like to enter dive gaps from really high up, that's generally not recommended because it's a lot harder, but doing this trick can actually save you doing those as well. Because instead of drifting and flying off course before you enter your tiny little dive gap, you can spiral and you can stay locked in and make it right through. And it's also important to note that you don't want to switch directions of your roll midway through. And that's kind of for two reasons. Number one is because you don't want to have to think about, okay, now I got to turn left if I was already rolling right, or vice versa. You want to keep it in one direction where your finger is already moving in that direction. You don't want to stop and reverse, because when you stop and reverse, you have that split second of time that your quad is pointed straight and it's stationary again, right? And that's gonna make you drift. So put simply, if you're drifting too much, roll a little bit tighter. And if you're not drifting enough, either don't roll at all or roll slower. And just keep in mind, you don't have to roll. This is only if you're not aligned well, but it does look pretty cool when you're rolling down a tight gap. So basically, my tips for dive gaps is really just 2 words: keep rolling. If you're trying to align something perfectly when you're 50 feet above it and you expect that to remain the same when you get down to it, it's just not going to. You gotta understand that. That's about all I got for this one. Just wanted to give you guys that quick little tip there. This has really, really helped me, especially in the Pacific Northwest here. We got tall trees, we got really tight dive gaps that extend just forever. They would probably not be possible without doing something like this. So just next time you try a dive gap, keep this in mind, especially if you're struggling with drift. So until the next one, thank you guys for watching. I hope you got something out of this. Keep ripping, keep wrecking, and keep learning. Peace.